Hi, this is Joel Rosenberg in Jerusalem, founder and editor-in-chief of All Israel News and our sister site, All Arab News. And we are talking about the issues that continue to challenge everybody here in this region. The number one security challenge, the number one geopolitical challenge in this part of the world right now, of course, is Iran. And the big question is, where is the Biden administration heading in its Iran policy? How will it handle Iran differently than the Trump administration? I think there's no question that Biden intends to do it differently. But how will he do it differently, he and his team, also from the Obama-Biden administration? Or are they continuing down the same basic trajectory? Now, as you know, I've been interviewing Democrats, Middle East experts who are close to Biden and were close to Obama in this series as we look at these things. But now we're going to talk to two officials that were in key places in the Trump administration and get their perspective. Admittedly different, but important. I want to start with two experts in this area. First is Victoria Coates. Victoria was a deputy national security advisor on the National Security Council during the Trump administration, focusing specifically on the area of the Middle East and North Africa. And then Len Khodorkovsky. Len was a senior advisor to the Trump administration's point man on the Iran policy issue, a man named Brian Hook. And they both served in a number of other roles, but for the point of this conversation, that's the core of who they are and sort of where their perspective is coming from. So first of all, Victoria and Len, thank you so much for being on All Israel News for your first time.
Thank you, Joel.
Thanks for having us, Joe.
Honored to have you guys, really. This is a hugely important conversation. It was when you guys were in the cockpit, as it were, just a few months back. And it's even in many ways, it appears that Iran is trying to force itself onto the Biden agenda, even though I think by all indications, Biden would prefer to be dealing with COVID, economy, COVID, China, COVID, Russia, maybe COVID, but Iran is sort of not letting that happen. Victoria, let's start with you from your angle at the National Security Council. What have been just the last 2.5, 3 months worth of activities by the Iranian government that is, I think by all indications, you'd have to say provocative, right?
Oh, it definitely is. And I actually think that the breaking news this morning, Joel, is the report from a group called Tanker Trackers, which Len and I are both very familiar with from our chasing of Iranian oil tankers over the past couple of years. But they came out with a really quite damning report about the Emerald, which is the ship that leaked the oil into the Eastern Mediterranean, that was Iranian oil. It was an illicit shipment to Syria. And it just goes to show you what this government is capable of. As you'll know better than we from where you are, that is an environmental catastrophe. It is extremely detrimental to Israel. The environment minister, I believe yesterday, called it environmental terrorism.
Right.
So for this administration, with the focus on climate and appointing former Secretary Kerry as our climate envoy, I'm very curious to see how they respond to this, because whether it was incompetence or malfeasance, the fact is that the Iranians did this. Heck, this could have happened in the Suez Canal. The ship came through the Suez, which would have been just catastrophic for international shipping. This is what they're capable of. And so I think the desire to get back into the JCPOA needs to be tempered with a dose of reality that this is who we're dealing with.
Just to follow up on that very quickly, Victoria, are the indications that this was intentional or simply, environmental mistake?
I think that's not clear yet. I think either way, this was predictable. The Iranians have been playing very fast and loose with what you'd call the norms of international shipping. They're constantly turning off their GPS to evade detection, which is very, very dangerous. The ships are old. They're not properly insured. And so this was, in a way, inevitable. And as I said, whether it was malfeasance or incompetence, quite frankly, I don't care. They did it. And I think we need to hold them to account for this, and the Biden administration needs to realize who they're dealing with.
Okay, so Len, if you know, I'm gonna flip around a very Jewish phrase this time of year for as we head into Passover. Dayenu, this alone would be enough, right? Iran, you pick any one of their actions, this alone would be enough to be bothered by them, to be upset with them, frustrated with them. But what Victoria is describing, as bad as it is, especially for those of us here in Israel, this is one of the least harmful things that they've done in the spectrum, right? What are some of the other specific areas you've got? Speaking of tankers, you've got a South Korean tanker. What happened with that? And of course, their movement on enriching uranium.
As Victoria said, this is very predictable. This is how they've operated for 40 some odd years. Extortion. In this case, it's natural disaster. Well, it's not natural. It's environmental disaster diplomacy. In other cases, it's nuclear brinksmanship diplomacy, or it's terrorism diplomacy. In the case of the South Korean vessel, it's hostage taking diplomacy. Basically, the regime saw an opportunity with the Biden administration to provoke the administration into opening up the negotiations again in a favorable way. There are very few cards that the regime had to play with, and one of them is doing these sorts of activities that they think would have an impact on concessions. Now, what we've seen from the Biden administration is concessions without any without the necessity of having to do any of these, without the regime having to do anything really, and so they're just doubling down on the very negligible leverage that they have in order to get favorable terms. So unfortunately, the Biden regime has fallen for it, and they're willing to indulge the world's top state sponsor of terrorism in getting back into this into a fantasy of some deal that's going to block their pathway to the bomb. They keep repeating that phrase. The original JCPOA didn't do that, and from where I can sit, I don't see any JCPOA 2.0 doing that either.
Okay, so if you take the totality, you've got continued terrorism, you've got attacks by Iranian proxy forces in Iraq against U.S. forces. You've got Iranian-backed proxy forces in Yemen, right? The Houthis, who have been taken off the terrorism list by the Biden administration. Sanctions have been removed from the Houthis, and the Houthis are firing missiles at our ally, the Saudis. Then you've got all these other things we're talking about, and of course, enriching uranium well past the JCPO limits to 20%. Now, in an interview I did with Dennis Ross not long ago, he said that in his view, enriching to 20% purity for uranium is crossing the very red line that Prime Minister Netanyahu laid out in his 2012 UN General Assembly speech as, if you go past this, you are going to trigger an attack from a military attack from Israel. Now, I talked to Benny Gantz. Now, he is the defense minister. He might not tell me if we were going to attack, but on the other hand, he said, no, I wouldn't say we're quite there, but we're getting dangerously close. Victoria, put all that together. Again, when I say that the Iranians are trying to force themselves on the agenda, what I'm saying is that my sense is that the economic maximum pressure, economic sanctions campaign that Trump, Pence, Pompeo and others prosecuted is being so successful that Iran doesn't want to be the 3rd, 4th, 10th, 20th agenda item, that they want to get these sanctions removed, but they also want to look like they're playing hard to get. Is that a fair read? Well, what's a better way to put it?
No, I think playing hard to get is the perfect way to put it, Joel. They have nothing to lose by continuing to say no, 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 while the administration says yes, yes, yes. And so they've gotten relief for their diplomats from at the UN. They have much more freedom of movement now. As you said, the Houthi have been taken off the FTO list, which is, in my view,
foreign terrorist organization list of the State Department.
Foreign terrorist organization, which is almost comically backwards, as the State Department has been forced to put out 3 separate statements condemning Houthi behavior, the violence
within days after being removed from the list. I mean,
and the day they were removed, that was the attack on Erbil. So again, I think we have to have a clear eye of what we're dealing with. The enrichment you describe is deeply dangerous. We know from the nuclear archive that Israel exposed that they have had a military nuclear program. That's clearly their intent. And the point of the maximum pressure campaign was to starve them of resources so they wouldn't be able to pay for it. And the idea that the administration is considering starting to unwind some of those sanctions to give them a lifeline at this moment is really mind-boggling to me, because the last time they had that, what they did was go on a campaign of violent mayhem across the region, and we're still seeing the ramifications of that.
Len, again, in your role at State, working with Brian Hook, who was the Trump administration's point man in a day-to-day way regarding the Iran policy and the maximum pressure campaign. I guess the question I have for you is, who looks more desperate to get a deal? I think, because I think Iran is desperate. I mean, Victoria, I think I know what you mean, but you said, what do they have to lose? What does Tehran have to lose by looking like, they had nothing to lose? But actually, I think they're being strangled or suffocated by the sanctions. They do want them removed. But Len, my sense is that what they want to look like they could wait forever, because they sense that they're smelling fear in the water. That the Biden administration is so eager to get back into something that if they play tough, Tehran will get more than they should. But I mean, that's a layperson's analysis. You were there. You know what the maximum pressure campaign is supposed to look like and what it was supposed to do. What is your read on that?
Unfortunately, I think the Biden administration seems more desperate than the regime. I think in the Supreme Leader Khamenei's mind, he has all the time in the world to wait, and really, in his mind, none of the pressure really affected the regime elite as far as he sees. So he's not really feeling the heat, whereas Rouhani perhaps and some of the political people, felt like they needed to respond to the growingly uneasy public. Certainly there were protests breaking out every so often, including the November 2019 protests when the regime massacred about 1,500 people. So from Khamenei's perspective, he knows the end game. The end game is that regardless of the deal, the goal is to get the nuclear weapon and to have a military weaponized nuclear program. Regardless of what the West does, that is the objective. And so whether it has a stamp of approval by the international community through an agreement that only one side abides by, he's willing to play that game. But in the end, that is not the objective. And unfortunately, the Biden administration is too willing to be duped again, and seems, through its actions, it seems desperate to have a diplomatic success that they can claim, which really accomplishes no strategic objective.
Victoria, when you look at the players that Biden has hired to be his inner circle, some of them were the very architects of the original Iran nuclear deal, his national security advisor, of course, but also Bill Burns, the nominated CIA director who's just been cleared by the Senate Intelligence Committee and seems on track probably without any problem to become the next CIA director. I'm actually listening to Burns's book. It's a fascinating book called The Back Channel right now on audio. And one of the things I'm trying to assess, and I'm curious, Victoria, on your take. Actually, I'm going to ask you the same question, Len, because people are policy, right? The people you hire are the people that are going to advise you and implement. The question I guess I'm asking myself is it unfair to think they're going to go down the same road because they're the original architects? Or is it possible that having learned what they may have done wrong, which I think the three of us all think they absolutely did wrong, but did they see how Iran has handled things over the last few years? Did they see why the Trump administration pulled out and the evidence of just even the last few weeks and months? I mean, people who run a football game and fumble, it doesn't mean the next game or the next quarter they can't come back and adjust their strategy. Victoria, how do you read the advisors to Biden?
Well, I would like to think that, Joel, unfortunately, from what was revealed in the Washington Times a week or so ago, they never saw a problem with the JCPOA, and the folks that Biden has surrounded himself with continued to meet with the Iranians during the Trump administration. And one of the things I found fascinating is, John Kerry was meeting with Zarif right around the period when one of Zarif's own diplomats, credentialed diplomats in Vienna, was hatching a terrorist plot to blow up Paris, which apparently wasn't even bad manners in John Kerry's estimation. But I think the fact that Assadi was tossed in jail in Belgium for 20 years last month is the pretty clear indication of who these people are. But I don't think this administration particularly cares about that. I think they care about the deal as what they would see as a monument to international diplomacy, that it's the P5+1, it's ratified by the United Nations. It's the principle. It's not even so much the substance of the deal as it is the principle of how this thing was reached is enormously important to them. And so I think for them, getting back into the deal and validating that kind of international context is really the critical thing. And so, unfortunately, I think it means we're in for another very bad deal.
Len, do you think that the Biden team has learned from the lessons of the first, I would call disastrous JCPOA deal?
I agree with Victoria. In the early days of the administration, at least through the confirmation hearings, there were some signals that they're going to try and, quote, broaden the range of views on Iran. That hasn't happened. The Obama team is now the Biden team on this file. And ironically, I don't know if your audience saw this, but a few weeks ago, there was an open letter from 38 Iranian dissidents in Iran, inside of Iran, who put their freedom and perhaps even their lives on the line by signing a letter to President Biden, asking him to essentially continue down the path of the Trump administration's Iran policy. And these are the people who are supposed to be who are supposed to be most affected by the policy. Unfortunately, the administration and Obama 2.0 team seems oblivious to the real impact of the deal and his intent, as Victoria said, on erecting a monument to diplomacy and pat themselves on the back for doing so. Look, I mean, the bottom line is, it's the people in the region who are on the front lines of the Iranian threat. It is not necessarily our European allies, but it's just a matter of time. With every missile test, with every with every day that passes by, where Iranians are continuing to do R&D under the auspices of JCPOA and beyond. The range of their missile grows. Soon, France, UK, Germany, and our other allies in the region in Europe are going to be threatened by those missiles, which is why I think the one thing that makes them nervous. And I think that's a point that needs to be pressed forward. But I mean, if you ask our friends in the region, Israel, Saudis, Emiratis, Bahrainis, everyone on the front lines, including the people of Iran themselves, they will tell you what the appropriate way to negotiate with the regime is, and that's through strength. And that is not the path that the Biden administration is going.
Victoria, just in the brief moments we have to finish, I want to ask you about Lebanon and Hezbollah. And not because I've got a novel coming out that deals with this, but I spent a day up on the border, the Israeli-Lebanon border, just last week, being briefed by Israeli intelligence and military officials. And as I said, I spoke to Defense Minister Benny Gantz a couple of weeks ago about this. My sense from them is that as bad as the second Lebanon war was, 4,000 missiles fired at Israel in a 34-day period, the concern of about a third Lebanon war would be those could be 4,000 missiles a day on Israel, because the arsenal of Hezbollah from Iranian bought and built missiles is swelled to well over 100,000, maybe 150,000 more. And the reason I bring up this is because if Israel were to have to take preemptive strikes, fearing that the Biden administration was going to let the cat out of the bag, the first line of defense, it seems, from Iran is not even their own long range, or long range, not ICBMs, but just here to Israel, but would be unleashing Hezbollah against us here. How do you read where Hezbollah fits in the Iranian strategic and tactical game that Tehran is playing?
Well, that is an excellent question, Joel, and we'll all look forward to reading your book. What's the title?
Well, yeah, and this is a nonprofit website, so I have to be careful. But anyway, the Beirut Protocol is the name of the novel. But yeah, and it's only fiction, but it's a worst case scenario.
I enjoy your books very much, so I'll look forward to that. But I think Hezbollah has been the gold standard for Iranian proxies. It's the model that they've used and tried to export to Iraq and Yemen, as well as Syria. And so it's an enormously serious problem. I think what you define in terms of the tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of rockets that they've stockpiled over the last couple of years, that is precisely what Iran did with the money from the JCPOA. So we can assume if there's a 2.0, they will do that again if they get sanctions relief. Now, the good news, if there is any in this scenario, is that the people of Lebanon appear to be waking up to what a cancerous blight Hezbollah is on what had been such a beautiful and prosperous country. And the escalating protests as the fiscal situation gets ever worse, I think, are an indicator that they are fed up with this. And if Lebanon is used as a launching pad for a massive attack on Israel, resulting in further misery for the Lebanese people, I think Hezbollah is going to have a very hard time holding on to much popular support. So I think pointing out the fact that Israel has no interest in a war with Lebanon, that Israel wants to help the people of Lebanon, and that this is entirely a foreign effort on the part of Iranians to stir the pot and create an irritant and possibly put the people of Lebanon in the middle of a terrible war. I think that's a vitally important message to send.
Well, I agree with you. And I actually quoted last week, and I was doing a series of stories on Hezbollah and that threat. I quoted a Lebanese member of parliament who says we're held captive, we're hostages to Iran, and so I don't know what the what the Lebanese people can do at this stage. In many ways, I fear that Lebanon has essentially become a province, for all intents and purposes, not a sovereign state, but a province of Iran and a forward operating base against Israel. And that's what, of course, they're trying to do with Syria as well. Thank you both. Go ahead.
If I might, on that
Please.
point, one of the benefits of the maximum pressure campaign in starving the regime of the funds to conduct its malign policies is it slashed Hezbollah's budget by about half. Now, it's still a formidable budget, and it's still enough for them to cause trouble. But when we say maximum pressure, that is maximum pressure, not just Iran, the Iranian regime itself. It's also pressure on its proxies. And so when Syrian fighters are saying, the good old days are over, or Hezbollah is putting out piggy banks and grocery stores to raise money for their operations, I mean, I think that is, and people see this. The Lebanese people see this. Iranian people see this. And Hezbollah has acknowledged that it's essentially an Iranian operation.
I think you're right, Len. But I think that back to Victoria's point, even before, basically the entire period of the Obama Biden administration, the UN resolution 1701, I believe, was just being violated day after day. So that even if you're cutting down the salaries of the people that are manning those missiles in the mosques, in the schools, in the hospitals, in people's homes today, the missiles are there in such larger numbers than we faced in 2006, and that seems bad. But I think that, let's just pray that it stays, the third Lebanon war scenario stays the realm of fiction and not fact. But I think it's one of those levers that make policymaking here in Jerusalem much more complicated. You can see that because Syria isn't a forward operating base yet, Israel feels that it has a degree of freedom of maneuver to keep it from becoming yet another Hezbollah Iranian, launching pad. But you're not seeing those types of nightly or weekly airstrikes inside Lebanon because the infrastructure is there and they're ready to go. And I think that Americans don't fully realize, and others around the world, that Hezbollah has actually killed more Americans than any other terrorist force except Al-Qaeda, and that they're ready to unleash, not just against Israel, but against Americans as well. Anyway, when I moved here to Israel, it wasn't to be a thriller writer, although being here, it is, when you think of radical Islamism, it's the gift that keeps on giving. There are no shortages of plots here because they're real. I'm just playing out, sort of a war game on, in print of what these leaders are saying they will do if they get the chance. Anyway, Victoria Coates, Len Khodorkovsky, thank you so much for taking the time. We've got so many other topics that I should come back to you on fairly soon. Is the Biden administration leading the U.S.-Saudi relationship to a train wreck?
Yes.
We don't want to blow up the relationship. We don't want to rupture the relationship. They said we want to recalibrate it, but we're going to accuse the Crown Prince of murder in print without any proof. We got a lot of problems ahead, but there'll be more things to talk about.
On that cheery note.
On that note. But thank you both, and thank you for both being part of All Israel News.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joel.